Earth had learned the sound of distant threats long before the Empire's message arrived. But this one carried a different weight because it came with certainty and numbers and a calm voice that believed resistance was already over. And when the transmission reached every screen and speaker across the planet, it stated that Earth would submit within 70 standard hours, dismantle all orbital defenses, surrender its fleets, and accept imperial governance for its own protection. And across the stars, the Empire believed this was mercy because it had crushed dozens of worlds for far less hesitation. Yet on Earth, the reaction was not panic or chaos, but quiet stillness that spread from command centers to factory floors and research labs and deep underground bunkers where men and women who were prepared for this moment exchanged brief looks and began executing plans written decades earlier. And in Washington, a middle-aged fleet admiral named Daniel Harper listened to the message with his hands folded and then turned to the officers around him and said the Empire had finally said out loud what it had always believed, that humans would fold the moment overwhelming force was mentioned. And in Geneva, Ambassador Laura Bennett closed her eyes for a long second before opening them and requesting an emergency planetary council session that would be broadcast live, not to beg or posture, but to speak plainly. While in orbit above Mars, Captain Eric Lawson watched the Imperial forward. Scouts slip into the outer system and noted how careless their formations were, as if no one expected resistance. And far beyond human space, the Imperial High Command convened in polished halls, where tall insectoid and scale figures discussed Earth as an inconvenience, a stubborn but insignificant species whose industrial output was impressive, but whose psychology was predictable. And they cited reports that humans argued endlessly among themselves and assumed that internal division would make compliance inevitable. Yet those reports ignored the history written into human memory, where survival had always depended on standing firm when retreat meant extinction. And as the hours passed, Earth did not respond with surrender but with silence, a silence of the Empire interpreted as fear, while beneath that silent shipyard increased output, crews boarded vessels sealed under civilian designations. Scientists released final encryption keys to dormant systems, and old veterans were recalled without announcement. And when the planetary broadcast finally began, Laura Bennett spoke without anger or theatrical defiance, stating that Earth acknowledged the message and rejected its terms entirely, explaining that humanity did not seek war, but would not accept domination. And she ended by saying that if the Empire chose violence, it would bear full responsibility for what followed. And across imperial space, the response was laughter and irritation, because to them Earth was making noise before the inevitable, unaware that the refusal was not bravado, but the final step in a long-accepted reality that someday a greater power would come, and that humanity had decided long ago that if that day arrived, they would not bend. They would endure, adapt, and if necessary fight until there was nothing left to take. And as the Empire began mobilizing its armadas under the assumption of an easy conquest, Earth's commanders watched calmly, knowing that the Empire was about to learn a lesson humans had taught themselves repeatedly across their own violent history, that threatening survival did not produce obedience. It produced resolve. The Empire's response to Earth's refusal was swift and confident, because confidence was the Empire's greatest weakness. And within hours, massive battle groups began translating into human space in carefully staged waves designed to overwhelm rather than adapt, while Imperial analysts assured their superiors that the humans would crumble once the first outer colonies were struck. And in the Grand Command Chamber, High Executive Croft observed the tactical displays with detached satisfaction as he explained to his subordinates that psychological collapse always preceded physical defeat. Yet even as he spoke, the first reports on the frontier carried an unexpected tone, because human installations did not flee or broadcast pleas, but instead activated layered defense grids that forced Imperial scouts to pull back with minor but embarrassing losses. And on Earth, Admiral Daniel Harper reviewed the data with a steady expression and ordered no pursuit, knowing the Empire needed to believe. These were isolated incidents rather than coordinated tests, while Captain Eric Lawson aboard the carrier Resolute led a task group through shadowed vectors, using emission silence and gravitational masking techniques that Imperial doctrine considered impractical for large fleets. And across human space, civilian traffic vanished as worlds enacted evacuation protocols disguised as routine drills. And the Empire misread this as chaos rather than preparation, and when the first Imperial strike fell upon a mining colony near Jupiter, it was meant to be a demonstration, a show of force to terrify Earth. But the colony had been emptied hours earlier, and automated defense platforms tore into the attacking ships with precision fire that targeted engines instead of hulls, leaving several Imperial cruisers drifting helplessly. And this result confused the local commanders, who reported back that humans fought inefficiently yet effectively, a contradiction that irritated High Executive Croft. While on Earth, Laura Bennett stood before the Planetary Council again and informed the population that the Empire had initiated hostilities, and that all civil authorities were now subordinate to Unified Defense Command. And there was no panic in the streets, but a grim acceptance as people remembered old stories of world wars and invasions where survival depended on collective effort, and factories converted overnight to military output, while universities became research hubs solving problems that had waited for this exact trigger. And within the Empire's fleet's officers began to notice patterns they did not like, because human forces avoided direct confrontation, yet struck supply lines with ruthless efficiency, using small, fast vessels that slipped through sensor nets thought to be impenetrable, and each lost convoy forced Imperial ships to slow, to wait, to question assumptions. And in the halls of Imperial Command, Croft dismissed these concerns and ordered a decisive push toward Earth itself, declaring that once the human homeworld was threatened, the resistance would end, unaware that humanity had never placed its survival in a single location, and that every delay, every overconfident advance, was feeding into a strategy built not on quick victory, but on exhausting an empire that had forgotten how to fight an enemy that refused to back down. As the Imperial armadas pushed deeper, they encountered a kind of resistance that did not fit their doctrine, because humanity did not defend space the way the Empire expected, but treated it like an extension of terrain warfare where patience and denial mattered more than spectacle. And this became clear when entire Imperial task forces arrived at predicted choke points, only to find them empty, while human ships struck from unexpected vectors that used planetary gravity wells and debris fields as cover, forcing Imperial commanders to react rather than dictate the battle. And aboard the resolute, Captain Eric Lawson watched tactical feeds with quiet focus as his crew executed maneuvers drilled for years without knowing the enemy they would face. And when a young officer asked why they did not press their advantage, Lawson replied that humans won wars by deciding when not to fight, a concept the Empire had never needed to learn. And back on Earth, Admiral Daniel Harper coordinated fleets, spread across light years through a command structure designed to function, even if entire nodes were destroyed, because redundancy was a lesson humanity had learned from disasters long before reaching the stars, while on the Imperial flagship, High Executive Croft grew increasingly frustrated as reports contradicted projections, showing human losses that were acceptable and controlled, while Imperial losses disrupted timetables and logistics, and advisors began to warn that the campaign was stretching supply lines beyond sustainable limits. But Croft silenced them and ordered an acceleration of the assault toward Earth, convinced that fear would still break human resolve. And when Imperial forces finally reached the inner system, they unleashed overwhelming firepower against orbital defenses that did not fully engage but instead absorbed damage and retreated in layers, drawing the Empire closer while revealing just enough resistance to suggest desperation. And across Earth cities, people followed the reports with tense calm as Laura Bennett addressed them again, explaining that the coming days would be hard, but that surrender would cost more than resistance ever could. And her words resonated because humans understood instinctively that backing down now would mean living under constant threat forever. And as Imperial fleets advanced, they began to encounter human ships that did not retreat, vessels crewed by older officers and volunteers who held critical positions long, enough for larger forces to reposition. And these sacrifices were not dramatic broadcasts, but quiet decisions made without hesitation. And slowly the Empire realized that humans were not fighting to win quickly, but to endure longer than the invader could tolerate, turning time itself into a weapon. And as the first Imperial capital ships fell not to superior firepower, but to coordinated strikes that exploited rigid command hierarchies, a cold understanding spread through the ranks that Earth was not breaking, and that the threat meant to force submission had instead awakened something far more dangerous, a species that had decided there were lines it would never cross backward, no matter the cost. The shift from confidence to concern within the Empire happened quietly, marked not by public announcements, but by subtle changes in orders and tone, because Imperial commanders began requesting reinforcements sooner than planned, and logistics officers flagged consumption rates that exceeded projections, and these internal signals never reached the propagandists who still broadcast inevitable victory. while humanity observed everything through intercepted transmissions and long-range sensors. And Admiral Daniel Harper understood that the Empire was doing what all dominant powers eventually did when challenged, doubling down on force rather than rethinking assumptions, and he allowed that instinct to guide human responses, approving operations that force Imperial fleets to commit deeper and burn resources faster. While Captain Eric Lawson led a strike that dismantled a mobile command node using a coordinated electronic assault, followed by kinetic fire that left the Imperial ships blind before destruction. And when reports of that loss reached High Executive Croft, he reacted with fury and ordered planetary bombardments of peripheral human worlds to demonstrate control, unaware that those worlds had already been stripped of strategic value, and that the images of destruction hardened human resolve rather than weakening it. And on Earth, Laura Bennett stood before a grim assembly and stated plainly that the Empire had crossed from coercion into atrocity, removing any remaining political barriers to total mobilization. And across the planet, volunteers flooded recruitment centers not out of excitement but necessity, because humans understood that survival was not guaranteed, and that participation was a price of agency. And as Imperial forces attempted to regroup near the asteroid belts, they encountered something new: human autonomous defense swarms that adapted in real time, altering patterns and attack priorities based on observed Imperial responses, forcing commanders to constantly revise tactics that their rigid training discouraged. And the psychological effect was immediate, as officers accustomed to predictable enemies found themselves reacting to machines guided by human intent rather than doctrine. And within Imperial ranks, whispers began to circulate that humans fought like a species that expected to be invaded and had planned accordingly, and those whispers unsettled veterans who had crushed dozens of civilizations that collapsed after the first show of overwhelming force. And when an Imperial admiral suggested negotiating a pause to reassess, High Executive Croft had him relieve the command for cowardice, reinforcing a culture that punished adaptation at the exact moment it was needed most. And as the Empire pushed closer, Earth had found not a desperate world clinging to survival, but a distributed war machine growing stronger with every engagement, fueled by a population that did not see retreat as an option. And in that realization, the Empire began to understand, too late, that threatening Earth had not revealed human weakness, but had instead unified a species around a single unbreakable truth: that there were no circumstances under which humans would back down from a fight for their future. By the time the Empire recognized that its momentum was stalling, the war had already entered a phase it could not easily escape, because humanity had shifted from reactive defense to deliberate counterpressure, and this transition was invisible to Imperial doctrine, which measured progress in territory seized rather than initiative gained. While Admiral Daniel Harper approved a sequence of operations designed not to destroy fleets outright, but to fracture command cohesion across multiple fronts, forcing the Empire to fight many small wars instead of one decisive campaign. And Captain Eric Lawson was reassigned to lead a composite task force built from ships that had never trained together, yet shared compatible systems and a common philosophy of decentralized authority. And this force struck an Imperial shipyard near a gas giant, not to occupy it, but to sabotage production lines and vanish before a response could be organized, leaving behind damage that would take months to repair and eroding the Empire's ability to replace losses. And within Imperial command circles, the first serious disagreements emerged as some leaders argued that Earth was no longer a peripheral problem, but a strategic threat, while others insisted that acknowledging this would undermine centuries of Imperial dominance built on the idea that resistance was futile. And High Executive Croft found himself balancing these voices, while clinging to the belief that a single overwhelming blow could still end the conflict. Yet every attempt to concentrate forces was met with human interference that disrupted timing and coordination, and on Earth, Laura Bennett worked with allied human colonies to formalize a unified declaration that framed the war not as a rebellion, but as a defense of sovereignty, a message that resonated even beyond human space as neutral civilizations quietly adjusted policies and restricted Imperial access, sensing a shift in the balance of power. And as weeks turned into months, Imperial crews grew exhausted fighting an enemy that refused to behave predictably, while human crews rotated through deployment supported by a civilian population that absorbed hardship without complaint, because scarcity and sacrifice were concepts deeply rooted in human history. And when an Imperial battle group finally attempted a direct assault on Earth's orbital perimeter, it encountered layered defenses that activated only when needed, revealing technologies the Empire had dismissed as theoretical or impractical, and the resulting engagement ended with several Imperial capital ships crippled and retreating, a defeat that could not be hidden from the wider galaxy. And in the aftermath, internal Imperial communications began referring to humans not as primitives or insurgents, but as a pure adversary, a subtle change in language that marked a profound shift in perception. And for the first time since issuing the ultimatum, High Executive Croft faced the reality that the threat, meant to force Earth into submission, had instead ignited a war of endurance the Empire was no longer certain could win, because humanity had shown again and again that when pushed to the edge it did not collapse or comply. It adapted, coordinated, and pressed forward with stubborn determination that refused to back down under any pressure. The realization that the war was no longer unfolding on Imperial terms began to affect decisions at every level of the Empire's hierarchy, because doubt spread faster than any human weapon, and this doubt manifested in hesitation, delayed orders, and commanders choosing caution where once there had been certainty, while humanity exploited this subtle fracture with relentless pressure that never allowed the Empire to regain its footing. And Admiral Daniel Harper authorized the release of long, classified strategic reserves not as a final gamble, but as a calculated signal meant to be detected, ensuring Imperial intelligence would see just enough to understand that Earth still held significant capacity in reserve, and this knowledge weighed heavily on Imperial planners who had assumed human strength was already fully committed, while Captain Eric Lawson's task force coordinated with civilian evacuation convoys that doubled as sensor nets, turning every movement into a data point that fed human predictive models. And these models began anticipating Imperial responses with unsettling accuracy, making each ambush feel inevitable rather than lucky, and on Earth Laura Bennett engaged in quiet diplomacy with neighboring non-aligned systems, offering transparency instead of threats. And the contrast between human openness and Imperial coercion began to reshape political calculations across nearby regions, leading to trade slowdowns and denied resupply that further strained Imperial logistics. And within the Imperial fleet, morale suffered as crews endured extended deployments far from home without the reassurance of clear progress, while rumors circulated of human ships reappearing after being listed as destroyed, repaired and returned to service through distributed manufacturing nodes the Empire had never considered worthwhile targets. And when High Executive Croft convened his senior commanders to demand solutions, the room was tense and divided, with some arguing for escalation beyond previous limits, and others warning that doing so would invite catastrophic retaliation. And Croft chose escalation because backing down was unthinkable in an empire built on fear, ordering the concentration of remaining elite fleets for a decisive thrust toward Earth, believing that symbolism still mattered more than attrition. And humanity anticipated this move because it aligned perfectly with Imperial psychology, and instead of reinforcing Earth directly, Harper ordered forces to withdraw just enough to invite pursuit, stretching the Empire's elite formations into vulnerable alignments. And as those formations advanced, they encountered coordinated resistance that attacked from multiple depths simultaneously, overwhelming command bandwidth and forcing captains to make independent decisions their training discouraged. And the resulting chaos led to friendly fire incidents and lost cohesion, while human forces maintained flexible coordination that allowed rapid exploitation of every mistake. And the battle did not end with a single dramatic explosion, but with a slow collapse of Imperial effectiveness as ships disengaged, retreated, or went silent. And across the galaxy, observers took note not who held territory, but of who controlled the tempo. It was clear now that humanity did. And in that moment, the Empire began to confront a truth it had never faced before, that threatening humans had not exposed fear or weakness, but had awakened a collective memory of survival against overwhelming odds, a memory that drove them forward with calm resolve. And as the war continued to tilt away from Imperial certainty, the lesson became unavoidable that humans did not back down, because backing down had never kept them alive. By the seventh phase of the conflict, the war had transformed from an attempted conquest into a struggle for Imperial survival, though few within the Empire were willing to name it as such, and this denial shaped decisions that further accelerated their decline, because High Executive Croft still framed every order as preparation for final victory rather than damage control, while humanity treated each engagement as one more step in a long campaign whose outcome depended on consistency rather than spectacle. And Admiral Daniel Harper now operated with clarity born of experience, knowing the Empire would commit its remaining strength not where it made sense, but where pride demanded, and he positioned human forces accordingly, not to defend symbols but to dismantle capability. While Captain Eric Lawson was promoted in the field and given authority over a mobile strike command that operated beyond traditional fleet structures, answering only to strategic intent rather than fixed objectives. And this freedom allowed human units to respond to emerging opportunities with speed the Empire could not match. And as Imperial elite fleets regrouped near a heavily fortified staging system and to serve as the launching point for a renewed push toward Earth, human intelligence confirmed what Harper already suspected, that this concentration represented not confidence but desperation, because it left vast regions underdefended and supply routes exposed, and rather than assaulting the staging system directly, Harper ordered simultaneous strikes across multiple Imperial holdings, targeting communication relays, fuel depots, and command academies that train replacement officers. And these attacks did not produce dramatic visuals, but they shattered the Empire's ability to recover, because ships without fuel were useless and officers without training made fatal mistakes. And within Imperial space, unrest began to surface as subject worlds noticed the weakening grip of authority and questioned why so many resources were being spent on a single stubborn species instead of maintaining order home. And Laura Bennett addressed this shift carefully, reiterating humanity's position that it sought no empire of its own, but would not ignore opportunities to ensure lasting security. And this message spread through informal channels and diplomatic backrooms, encouraging neutrality where once fear had ensured compliance. And as Imperial fleets finally advanced from their staging system, they found human resistance everywhere except where expected, and the carefully prepared assault corridors led into layered kill zones that forced Imperial commanders to choose between retreat and annihilation, and many chose retreat, an act that would have been unthinkable months earlier. And this erosion of Imperial resolve culminated in a decisive engagement where coordinated human forces isolated and disabled the Empire's most prestigious battle group, capturing its command vessel intact. And when news of this capture reached High Executive Croft, the shock was profound, because for the first time the Empire could not control the narrative, and across the galaxy the image of an Imperial flagship under human control became a symbol not of brute force, but a strategic defeat. And in that moment, even the most loyal Imperial citizens began to question whether threatening Earth had been the greatest mistake in their history, because humanity had proven not only that it would never back down, but that once committed it will methodically dismantle any power that tried to force it to kneel. The end of the war did not arrive with a single declaration or a ceremonial surrender, but with a slow and undeniable collapse of Imperial authority that spread outward from the failed campaign against Earth. Because once the illusion of invincibility was broken, it could not be repaired. And High Executive Croft remained in command officially even as entire sectors stopped responding to his orders, choosing instead to secure their own borders or negotiate quiet ceasefires with neighboring powers. And humanity observed this unravel without triumphal broadcasts or public celebration, because Admiral Daniel Harper understood that empires did not truly end with explosions but with loss of control, and he instructed human forces to consolidate gains, secure defensive perimeters, and avoid unnecessary destruction, sending a clear signal that humanity's objective had never been domination but survival, while Captain Eric Lawson oversaw the decommissioning of captured Imperial assets, treating former enemies with firm restraint rather than vengeance, a choice that confused Imperial prisoners who had been taught to expect cruelty from those who resisted the Empire. And on Earth, Laura Bennett addressed the planet one final time regarding the conflict, stating plainly that the Empire had withdrawn all remaining forces from human space and formally acknowledged Earth's sovereignty. And she reminded the population that this outcome had not been achieved through superior numbers alone, but through unity, patience, and a refusal to surrender when threatened. And across the galaxy, the story of the war spread in fragments and first-hand accounts, not as a tale of glorious human conquest, but as a warning about misjudging a species shaped by centuries of hardship and adaptation. And new diplomatic doctrines emerged that treated humanity with caution and respect, not because humans demanded it, but because the cost of ignoring them had been made clear. And within the remnants of the Empire, debates raged for years about where everything had gone wrong, with historians eventually agreeing on a simple conclusion, that the initial threat to Earth had been based on a false assumption that fear would produce compliance, when in reality it had unified humanity in a way no external enemy ever had before. And as the galaxy adjusted to a new balance of power, Earth returned to rebuilding and exploration, carrying forward the memory of a war, that prove a defining truth about. They're species that humans could be peaceful, cooperative, and open, but when faced with extinction or subjugation, they would stand their ground with quiet determination, adapt faster than expected, and endure longer than any empire that believed threats alone could force them to back down. And in that lesson, the wider galaxy finally understood why threatening Earth had been the greatest mistake the Empire ever made.